The consciousness that is reading these words right now, the conscious awareness that is recognizing the meaning of these specific sentences as they appear, may have a physical basis that the standard cultural framework has not adequately addressed. The standard framework treats consciousness as an emergent product of complex neural arrangements, with the emergence being the consequence of sufficient computational complexity rather than the consequence of any specific physical principle. The framework has been the dominant view within both mainstream neuroscience and popular understanding for substantial periods of the past several decades. But the framework has serious difficulties that have been articulated by various contemporary physicists and philosophers, with the difficulties pointing toward the possibility that consciousness may have a much more specific physical basis than the merely emergent framework would suggest. The starting point for the inquiry that follows is the recognition that one of the most fundamental forces of physical reality, gravity itself, may be the very mechanism through which consciousness arises in physical systems. The implications of this recognition, if it can be sustained, are substantial. The implications would suggest that consciousness is not merely a feature of complex biological systems, but is connected to the deepest structure of physical reality at the level of the force that shapes spacetime itself. The implications would suggest that the conscious awareness that you have right now is participating in physical processes that operate at the foundation of the universe, rather than being merely the byproduct of biochemical activity in your brain. The implications would suggest that the various contemplative traditions that have articulated frameworks within which consciousness has a fundamental rather than derivative status may have been articulating recognitions that contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. The inquiry that follows examines these implications in detail. The starting point for any serious inquiry into the relationship between gravity and consciousness is the work of Roger Penrose, the British mathematical physicist whose contributions across the past several decades have shaped contemporary thinking about these questions. Penrose, who shared the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics for his earlier work on black hole formation, has spent substantial portions of his career developing a framework within which consciousness has a specific physical basis that involves the interaction between quantum mechanics and gravitational effects. The framework, articulated most fully in his books The Emperor's New Mind, published in 1989, and Shadows of the Mind, published in 1994, holds that consciousness arises through specific quantum processes in the brain that involve gravitational effects at the level of fundamental spacetime structure. The framework has been controversial throughout its existence, with various critics arguing that the framework involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. But the framework has continued to develop and to attract serious attention, with recent empirical work having provided support for at least some of its specific predictions. The basic structure of Penrose's framework deserves careful examination because of its sophistication. Penrose argues that the standard computational account of consciousness, on which conscious experience emerges from the processing of information by neural networks that operate according to classical physical principles, cannot adequately account for several specific features of conscious experience. These features include the apparent capacity of consciousness to engage with mathematical truths that are not algorithmically derivable from any specific set of axioms, the unified subjective character of conscious experience that integrates multiple sources of information into a single felt whole, and the specific temporal structure of consciousness that involves the moment-to-moment generation of experience rather than the continuous flow that classical computation would produce. The arguments for these specific claims have been developed in detail across Penrose's various publications, with the broader framework that emerges providing a sustained challenge to the merely computational account of consciousness that has dominated mainstream thinking. The first of these arguments, drawn from Penrose's engagement with Gödel's incompleteness theorems, holds that human mathematical insight involves the recognition of mathematical truths that cannot be derived through any specific algorithmic procedure. Penrose argues that this capacity demonstrates that human consciousness involves something beyond what algorithmic computation can produce, with the implications being that any account of consciousness that treats it as fundamentally algorithmic must be inadequate. The argument has been controversial within philosophy of mathematics, with various critics offering important responses, but the argument articulates a specific challenge to the merely computational account of consciousness that has continued to motivate engagement with Penrose's broader framework. The second of these arguments concerns the unified subjective character of conscious experience, often called the binding problem within consciousness studies. The argument holds that conscious experience involves the integration of information from multiple sources into a single felt whole, with the integration occurring in a manner that classical computation cannot easily explain. The visual experience that you have right now, with its integration of color, shape, motion, depth, and contextual recognition into a single unified perception, involves a kind of binding that the merely computational account has difficulty fully addressing. Penrose argues that this binding may involve quantum coherent processes that integrate information across the brain in ways that classical computation cannot achieve, with the quantum coherence being the means by which the unified character of conscious experience is produced. The third argument concerns the specific temporal structure of consciousness. Conscious experience does not unfold as a continuous flow, but rather involves discrete moments that are integrated into the apparent continuity of subjective time. The framework that Penrose has developed treats these moments as corresponding to specific orchestrated objective reductions, with each reduction producing a discrete moment of conscious experience. The framework provides resources for understanding why consciousness has the specific temporal phenomenology it has, with the moment-to-moment generation of experience corresponding to the moment-to-moment occurrence of orchestrated quantum reductions in microtubules within neurons. The specific physical mechanism that Penrose proposes for consciousness involves what he calls objective reduction, the process by which quantum superposition states collapse into specific definite states through interaction with gravitational effects, rather than through the action of any external observer. The framework holds that quantum systems that have evolved into superposition states must eventually undergo reduction to specific states, with the timescale for this reduction being determined by the gravitational energy difference between the superposed states. For small systems with small gravitational energy differences, the reduction takes very long timescales, with the quantum coherence being maintained across periods that allow for the kind of quantum computation that quantum information science has been developing. For larger systems with larger gravitational energy differences, the reduction takes much shorter timescales, with the rapid collapse explaining why macroscopic objects do not exhibit quantum behavior in everyday experience. The technical structure of the objective reduction proposal deserves careful attention. The standard interpretation of quantum mechanics holds that quantum systems exist in superposition states that involve all possible outcomes simultaneously, with the collapse to a specific outcome occurring only when the system interacts with a measuring device or with an observer. The various interpretations of quantum mechanics, including the Copenhagen interpretation, the many worlds interpretation, and various others, have addressed the question of how this collapse occurs in different ways, with the question remaining one of the foundational puzzles of contemporary physics. The objective reduction framework that Penrose has developed proposes that the collapse occurs through a specific physical mechanism that involves gravitational effects at the level of space-time structure. The framework treats space-time itself as becoming unstable when quantum superposition states involve substantial gravitational energy differences, with the instability producing the collapse to specific outcomes. The framework has implications for understanding the threshold at which classical behavior emerges from quantum behavior. The standard treatment of decoherence, articulated most fully in the work of Max Tegmark and various other physicists, holds that classical behavior emerges from quantum behavior through the interaction of quantum systems with their environments, with the interaction producing the rapid loss of quantum coherence. The objective reduction framework provides a different account, with the transition to classical behavior occurring through the gravitational mechanism rather than through environmental decoherence alone. The framework has been controversial because the gravitational mechanism has not been definitively established within mainstream physics, but the framework provides a specific testable prediction that distinguishes it from the standard decoherence account. The application of this framework to consciousness emerges from Penrose's collaboration with Stuart Hameroff, the American anesthesiologist whose work on microtubules within neurons provided the specific biological substrate within which the framework could operate. Hameroff had been studying microtubules, the protein structures that constitute the cytoskeleton of all eukaryotic cells, with particular attention to their role in neuronal function. The collaboration between Penrose and Hameroff produced what has become known as the orchestrated objective reduction theory, often abbreviated as ORC. The framework holds that consciousness is associated with quantum coherent states in microtubules within neurons, with the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involving the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states through the gravitational mechanism that Penrose had identified. The framework has been articulated in detail across numerous publications by Penrose and Hameroff, with the specific predictions being subject to ongoing empirical investigation. The framework predicts that consciousness should be associated with specific quantum coherent processes in microtubules, with the processes operating at specific frequencies that the theory can characterize. The framework predicts that anesthetics that bind to microtubules should produce specific effects on consciousness that the theory can account for. The framework predicts that the timescales of conscious processing should correspond to the timescales predicted by the gravitational reduction mechanism. The empirical work that has been conducted to test these predictions has produced results of substantial interest, with the broader framework continuing to develop in response to the empirical findings. The work of Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan has provided some of the most striking empirical support for specific predictions of the OR framework. Bandyopadhyay's research, conducted in collaboration with Hameroff and various other researchers, has documented quantum coherent vibrations in microtubules under physiologically relevant conditions. The findings, published in various peer-reviewed papers across the past several years, have established that microtubules exhibit the kinds of quantum behaviors that the OR framework would predict, with the behaviors being maintained at temperatures and conditions that are present in living neural tissue. The findings have been controversial within mainstream neuroscience, with various critics raising concerns about the specific conditions under which the measurements were made, but the findings have continued to be replicated and extended by subsequent researchers. The specific findings that Bandyopadhyay's research has documented deserve attention because of their implications for the broader framework. The research has identified specific resonant frequencies in microtubules that correspond to the predictions of the OR theory, with the frequencies being maintained even at warm temperatures where standard treatments of quantum coherence would predict rapid decoherence. The findings have implications for the long-standing concern that warm biological systems should not be capable of supporting the kind of quantum coherence that the OR framework requires, with the empirical findings suggesting that specific structural features of microtubules may provide protection against decoherence that allows quantum effects to operate at biological temperatures. The work continues to develop, with the broader research program providing increasing empirical support for the framework, even as substantial questions remain open. The 2024 work of Mike Wiest and his collaborators at Wellesley College has provided additional empirical support for the broader framework. Wiest's research examined the effects of microtubule stabilizing anesthetics on consciousness in animal models, with the findings documenting that anesthetics that bind specifically to microtubules produce effects on consciousness that are consistent with the predictions of the OR theory. The findings provide one of the more direct empirical tests of the framework's specific predictions about the relationship between microtubule function and conscious experience, with the convergence between the predictions and the empirical findings being one of the features that has motivated continued engagement with the framework. The specific experimental design that Wiest's research employed deserves attention because of its methodological care. The research compared the effects of different anesthetics with different binding properties, with the comparison allowing the specific role of microtubule binding to be isolated from other potential mechanisms. The findings documented that the timing and intensity of anesthetic effects on consciousness corresponded to the specific microtubule binding properties of the anesthetics, with the correspondence providing direct empirical support for the role of microtubules in conscious experience. The findings do not by themselves establish that the OR framework is correct in all its specific commitments, but the findings provide direct empirical support for the general framework that the merely computational account of consciousness cannot easily accommodate. The implications of the framework for understanding consciousness are substantial. If the framework is correct in its strongest form, consciousness is not the emergent product of complex computational arrangements, but is the consequence of specific physical processes involving the interaction between quantum mechanics and gravity at the fundamental level of space-time. Structure. The consciousness that you have right now would be, on this framework, the consequence of orchestrated quantum reductions occurring in microtubules within your neurons, with the reductions being governed by gravitational mechanisms that operate at the most fundamental level of physical reality. The framework treats consciousness not as a feature that emerges when biological systems reach a certain complexity threshold, but as a feature of how the universe operates at the deepest level, with biological systems being one of the means through which this feature becomes accessible to specific observers. The careful position with respect to the framework requires acknowledging both what it offers and what remains controversial. The framework has not been definitively established within mainstream neuroscience, with substantial portions of the field continuing to operate within the merely computational framework that the OR framework challenges. The specific mechanisms that the framework proposes have not been worked out in complete detail, with various technical questions remaining open. The empirical support for the framework, while growing through the Bandyopadhyay and Wiest research, has not yet reached the level that would establish the framework as the accepted account of consciousness. But the framework provides a sophisticated alternative to the merely computational account, with the alternative being grounded in serious physics and serious neuroscience rather than in speculation alone. The work of Carlo Rovelli, the Italian theoretical physicist whose contributions to quantum gravity have been among the most influential in contemporary physics, provides complementary resources for thinking about the relationship between gravity and consciousness. Rovelli's work on loop quantum gravity, which provides one of the major contemporary approaches to unifying quantum mechanics with general relativity, has produced a framework within which the deepest structure of physical reality involves discrete quantum events that constitute space-time itself, rather than occurring within a pre-existing space-time background. The framework has been articulated for general readers in Rovelli's books, including The Order of Time and Reality is Not What It Seems, with the broader picture that emerges, providing a context within which the relationship between gravity and consciousness can be reformulated. The implications of Rovelli's framework for consciousness, while not Rovelli's primary concern in his technical work, are substantial. If spacetime itself is constituted by discrete quantum events at the deepest level, and if consciousness is associated with quantum processes that involve gravitational reduction as the Penrose-Hameroff framework suggests, then consciousness may be participating in the very processes through which spacetime is constituted, rather than being merely located within a pre-existing spacetime. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications to consciousness, but it provides a context within which the relationship between gravity and consciousness can be formulated in ways that exceed what the merely classical framework allows. The work of Smolin, the American theoretical physicist whose contributions to quantum gravity and the foundations of physics have been substantial, provides additional resources for thinking about these questions. Smolin's work, summarized in his books The Trouble with Physics and Time Reborn, has argued that contemporary physics has been substantially hampered by frameworks that treat time as merely an illusion or as derivative from more fundamental timeless structures. The framework that Smolin has developed argues for the reality of time as a fundamental feature of physical reality, with the implications for consciousness following naturally. If time is fundamental, and if consciousness involves the moment-to-moment generation of experience that the Core framework suggests, then consciousness may be participating in the fundamental temporal structure of reality, rather than being merely a feature of how time appears to subjective observers. The philosophical engagement with the relationship between gravity and consciousness has its own substantial history that runs parallel to the contemporary physics. The work of Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher whose 19th century engagement with these questions produced one of the most distinctive frameworks in the Western tradition, articulated a position within which the fundamental reality of the universe is what he called the will, with all specific phenomena, including both physical forces and conscious experiences, being expressions of this single underlying reality. Schopenhauer's framework, articulated most fully in his book The World as Will and Representation, treats the various forces of physics, including gravity, as manifestations of the same will that becomes consciously aware of itself through conscious beings. The framework has been controversial across subsequent philosophy, but the framework articulates a recognition about the unity of physical force and conscious experience that has continued to influence thinking about these questions. Schopenhauer's specific treatment of gravity within this framework deserves particular attention. He argued that gravity, considered from the inside as the experience of being a body that is pulled toward other bodies, is what we recognize as the will when we encounter it in its most basic physical manifestation. The framework holds that the same reality that we encounter as conscious will within ourselves is the reality that operates as gravitational attraction in physical systems, with the apparent difference between the two being a difference in perspective rather than in fundamental nature. The framework has been criticized for various reasons, including the difficulty of testing its specific claims empirically. But the framework articulates a recognition about the unity of consciousness and physical force that has parallels in various other traditions, and that the contemporary physics of consciousness is now in a position to engage with seriously. The framework that Schopenhauer developed had substantial influence on subsequent philosophy and on the broader cultural engagement with these questions. The framework influenced Friedrich Nietzsche, who developed his own engagement with these themes in directions that emphasized the will to power rather than the will to existence that Schopenhauer had identified. The framework influenced Sigmund Freud, who adapted elements of the Schopenhauerian framework into his theoretical accounts of unconscious motivation. The framework influenced various other 20th century philosophers, with the broader tradition of metaphysical reflection on the unity of consciousness and physical force continuing to develop even when the specific Schopenhauerian framework has been substantially modified or rejected. The work of Henri Bergson, the French philosopher whose engagement with questions about consciousness and physical reality across the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced some of the most sophisticated articulations in the Western tradition, addressed these questions with characteristic depth. Bergson's framework, developed across his books including Matter and Memory and Creative Evolution, treats consciousness as fundamentally temporal in character, with the duration that Bergson called durée being the essential feature of conscious experience that exceeds what spatial physical descriptions can capture. The framework has parallels with the contemporary recognition that consciousness involves specific temporal structures that exceed what merely computational accounts can address, with the convergence between Bergson's philosophical articulation and the contemporary physics of time being one of the more interesting points in the history of these questions. Bergson's specific engagement with the question of how consciousness relates to physical force has been developed by various subsequent philosophers, with the broader tradition that has emerged, providing resources for thinking about consciousness that exceed what merely materialist frameworks would allow. The framework treats consciousness not as something that emerges from physical processes, but as something that participates in the same fundamental reality that physical processes participate in, with the participation being the means by which the apparent separation between consciousness and physical force is overcome. The framework has substantial parallels with both the Schopenhauerian framework that preceded it and the contemporary Penrose Hameroff framework that has emerged from physics rather than from philosophy, with the convergence between these different traditions on similar structural recognitions being one of the features that the broader inquiry reveals. The work of Alfred North Whitehead, the British philosopher whose process philosophy developed across the first half of the 20th century, articulated a framework within which the fundamental units of reality are what Whitehead called actual occasions of experience, with each such occasion involving both physical and experiential aspects. The framework has been controversial across subsequent philosophy, but the framework articulates a recognition about the unity of physical process and conscious experience that has direct parallels to what the Penrose-Hameroff framework proposes within a different vocabulary. The convergence between Whitehead's process philosophy and the contemporary physics of consciousness is one of the features that the comparative study of these frameworks reveals, with the recognition that fundamentally different traditions have arrived at structurally parallel positions being one of the more striking patterns in the broader inquiry. The contemporary philosophical engagement with these questions has continued to develop through the work of David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and various other philosophers who have argued for what has come to be called proto-panpsychism. The framework articulated most fully in Chalmers's book The Conscious Mind, and Strawson's papers including Realistic Monism, holds that consciousness must be a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than an emergent product of arrangements of allegedly non-conscious matter. The framework has been controversial within mainstream philosophy of mind, but the framework articulates a recognition that has substantial implications for understanding how gravity and consciousness might be related. If consciousness is fundamental, then the relationship between consciousness and physical forces, including gravity, may be more direct than the merely emergent framework would suggest, with both consciousness and physical forces being aspects of the same underlying reality, rather than being fundamentally different categories of phenomenon. The implications of these various frameworks for understanding consciousness are substantial, even when the specific commitments of each framework remain controversial. The frameworks converge on the recognition that consciousness may have a much more fundamental status than the merely emergent framework would suggest, with the fundamental status being connected to the deepest physical structures, including gravity itself. The frameworks do not establish that any specific account of how gravity and consciousness are related is correct, but the frameworks establish that the question of how they are related is a genuine question that can be addressed through the careful integration of physics and philosophy. There is a particular feature of the Orch-Orr framework that deserves additional attention because of its specific implications for how consciousness should be understood. The framework treats consciousness as involving the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience through orchestrated quantum reductions, with each conscious moment being a discrete event rather than being part of a continuous flow. The framework has implications for the phenomenology of consciousness that have not been fully explored within mainstream philosophical work, but that have parallels in various contemplative traditions that have articulated the moment-to-moment character of conscious experience. The convergence between the framework's predictions about the discrete character of consciousness and the contemplative tradition's articulations about the moment-to-moment nature of conscious experience is one of the more striking convergences that the broader inquiry will eventually examine. The contemplative traditions have, for thousands of years, addressed the questions about the relationship between consciousness and the fundamental forces of reality, with their own different methods and within their own different frameworks. The Christian tradition has developed extensive theological reflection on the relationship between God and the physical universe, with Augustine's articulation of pondus, the weight or gravitational pull that draws things toward their proper place, providing one of the most striking metaphorical foundations within the tradition. The Islamic tradition has articulated frameworks within which the divine attraction that draws all things toward their proper relationship with divine reality has been a central concern, with the Sufi vocabulary of Kazibeh and the broader Islamic philosophical engagement with these questions providing substantial resources. The Hindu tradition has developed concepts of cosmic attraction, including the akasana, through which divine reality draws conscious beings toward their proper destination. The Taoist tradition has articulated the natural pull of the Tao that operates through all phenomena, including consciousness itself. The convergence between these traditional articulations and the contemporary physics is one of the features that the broader inquiry will examine in detail. Augustine's specific articulation of pondus in the 13th book of the Confessions provides one of the most philosophically sophisticated treatments of this theme within the Christian tradition. Augustine writes that his weight is his love, with the love being the gravitational pull that draws him toward what he properly belongs with. The framework treats the gravitational metaphor as more than merely metaphorical, with the recognition that the natural physical pull of bodies toward each other through gravity, and the spiritual pull of conscious beings toward their proper good through love, participate in the same fundamental structural reality. The framework has been developed by subsequent Christian thinkers across more than 15 centuries, with the broader tradition that has emerged, providing resources for thinking about the relationship between consciousness and gravity that the merely materialist framework cannot offer. The convergence between Augustine's framework and the contemporary Penrose Hameroff framework, despite the profound differences in their methods and contexts, is one of the more striking convergences in the broader history of human thought about consciousness and physical force. The Sufi tradition has developed the concept of Kazibeh with similar philosophical depth, with the divine attraction being understood as the means by which the soul is drawn toward its proper relationship with divine reality. The framework has been articulated across the Sufi tradition by thinkers including Mevlana, whose verses on the magnetic pull of the divine reality have shaped Turkish religious sensibility across more than 7 centuries. The framework treats the gravitational metaphor as more than merely metaphorical, with the recognition that physical attraction and spiritual attraction may participate in the same fundamental structural reality. The convergence between the Sufi articulation and the contemporary physics is one of the features that the broader inquiry will examine in detail, with the recognition that traditions across widely separated cultures have arrived at structurally parallel positions being one of the more striking patterns in the comparative study of these questions. What the contemporary research has begun to suggest, when it is considered alongside these contemplative traditions, is that the question of how gravity and consciousness are related may not be the merely theoretical question that mainstream physics and mainstream philosophy have treated it as. The question may be a question about the fundamental structure of reality and the place of conscious experience within it, with answers that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions are all in a position to engage from their own different angles. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own pre-scientific vocabularies recognitions about the relationship between consciousness and the fundamental forces that contemporary research is now in a position to confirm or refine through its own different methods. The convergence is not coincidence. The convergence is the consequence of the fact that the traditions were attending carefully to features of consciousness that have a real basis in how reality is actually structured, even when the technical resources for articulating this basis were not yet available. The body that reads these words has, across the moments of this reading, generated consciousness through processes that may involve the very gravitational mechanisms that shape space-time itself. The consciousness that you have right now is not, on the frameworks that the inquiry has been examining, merely the byproduct of biochemical activity in your brain, but may be the consequence of fundamental physical processes that connect your conscious experience to the deepest structures of reality. None of this is hypothetical in any merely speculative sense. The Orchar framework has been developed by serious physicists and serious neuroscientists, with the framework receiving increasing empirical support through the Bandyopadhyay and Wiest research. The framework is not the established consensus, but the framework is a sophisticated and increasingly supported alternative to the merely computational account that has dominated mainstream thinking. The implications for how you should understand the conscious experience that you are having right now are substantial. Your conscious awareness, on this framework, is not merely the production of patterns of neural firing that occur within your brain. Your conscious awareness is the consequence of orchestrated quantum reductions that occur in microtubules within your neurons, with the reductions being governed by gravitational mechanisms that operate at the most fundamental level of physical reality. The same force that shapes space-time itself, that pulls planets around stars and galaxies around galactic clusters, may be the very mechanism through which your conscious experience is constituted in each moment. The implications continue beyond what this single paragraph can adequately address. The question is what these findings actually mean, what they tell us about the nature of conscious existence, and how the various frameworks that have been examining these questions can be brought into productive engagement with each other. The next stage of the inquiry will examine the deeper physical theories that have been developed to address these questions, with particular attention to the work on quantum gravity and to the broader frameworks within which the documented phenomena of consciousness can be understood as participating in the fundamental structure of physical reality. There is something profoundly wrong with the standard picture of consciousness as a localized phenomenon. The findings we have examined establish that consciousness may involve gravitational mechanisms operating at the level of fundamental space-time structure, with the implications being that the conscious experience you are having right now is participating in physical processes that extend far beyond the boundaries of your skull. The Penrose Hameroff framework is real. The empirical support is increasing. The philosophical foundations are sophisticated, but the standard neuroscience framework, despite the sophistication of its findings, leaves a deeper question unaddressed. The question concerns what the relationship between gravity and consciousness actually is, when we have set aside the merely localized picture that ordinary thinking assumed, and what kind of structural features of reality this relationship reveals. The materialist framework treats consciousness as occurring within the brain, with the brain being located within a pre-existing space-time that gravity merely shapes from outside. But the materialist framework does not address whether consciousness might participate in the very processes through which space-time itself is constituted. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is whether contemporary physics has anything to contribute to this deeper question, and what the implications might be for how the documented phenomena of consciousness should be understood within the broader structure of physical reality. The starting point for this deeper inquiry is the recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests it has. The block universe interpretation of relativity, articulated most fully in the philosophical work of various physicists and philosophers, holds that the past, present, and future all exist with equal reality, with the apparent flow of time being a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of the underlying physical structure. The framework derives from the implications of special and general relativity for the relationship between simultaneity and reference frames, with different observers having different definitions of what counts as simultaneous, and the implications for any privilege present being substantial. The framework has been articulated by physicists including Hermann Minkowski in the early 20th century, and developed by subsequent thinkers including Hilary Putnam, Brian Greene, and various others working at the intersection of physics and philosophy. The implications of the block universe framework for the relationship between gravity and consciousness are striking. If spacetime itself is the four-dimensional structure that the block universe framework describes, and if gravity is the curvature of this spacetime as general relativity holds, then gravity is not merely a force that operates within time, but is a feature of the very structure of spacetime that includes all of time. The consciousness that emerges through the Penrose-Hameroff mechanism, with its specific gravitational reductions occurring across the moments of conscious experience, is not merely producing experience within a pre-existing temporal sequence, but is participating in the curvature structure of the four-dimensional spacetime that constitutes reality at its deepest level. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications, but the framework provides resources for thinking about the relationship between consciousness and time that exceed what the merely sequential framework allows. The work on retrocausality and the time-symmetric formulation of quantum mechanics by Yakir Aharonov and his collaborators provides additional resources for thinking about how gravity, time, and consciousness are related. The two-state vector formalism, articulated by Aharonov and his colleagues across many papers, treats quantum systems as being constrained by both initial and final boundary conditions, with the present state of the system being shaped by both its past and its future. The implications of this framework for the relationship between consciousness and gravity are subtle but significant. If consciousness involves gravitational reductions that operate on quantum states, and if these quantum states are themselves constrained by both past and future boundary conditions, then consciousness may be participating in temporal processes that exceed the merely sequential structure of ordinary causation. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but the resources it provides for thinking about why consciousness has the specific temporal phenomenology it has are substantial. The application of the Aharonov framework to consciousness has been developed by various researchers, with the implications for understanding the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience being particularly interesting. The Orch-OR framework that we examined earlier treats each moment of conscious experience as corresponding to a specific orchestrated objective reduction, with the reductions occurring at timescales determined by gravitational mechanisms. If these reductions are also constrained by future boundary conditions through the kind of retrocausality that the Aharonov framework articulates, then conscious experience may be involving more sophisticated temporal structures than the merely forward-flowing framework would suggest. The framework provides resources for understanding why consciousness has the specific anticipatory and integrative features it has, with the features being natural consequences of the temporal structures that the Aharonov framework identifies. The convergence between the Aharonov framework and the block universe framework that we examined earlier provides additional resources for understanding the relationship between consciousness, gravity, and time. If the past and future both exist with equal reality in the broader spacetime structure as the block universe framework holds, and if the present states of physical systems are constrained by both past and future boundary conditions as the Aharonov framework holds, then consciousness may be the means by which the broader spacetime structure becomes aware of itself within specific localized regions. The framework remains speculative in its strongest forms, but the convergence between these different frameworks on similar structural recognitions is one of the features that motivates continued engagement with these questions. The holographic principle in physics provides another framework within which the relationship between gravity and consciousness can be reformulated. The principle, articulated most fully through the work of Jacob Bekenstein on black hole entropy, Gerard Hooft on dimensional reduction, and Leonard Susskind on the broader theoretical framework, holds that the information content of a three-dimensional region of space can be encoded on its two-dimensional boundary. The principle emerged from research on black holes, where the entropy of the black hole was found to be proportional to the area of its event horizon rather than to its volume. The principle has been extended to apply to physical reality more generally, with the implications for the relationship between information and space-time being substantial. The specific origins of the holographic principle in black hole research deserve attention because of their philosophical implications. Jacob Bekenstein's work in the early 1970s on black hole thermodynamics established that black holes have entropy, and that this entropy is proportional to the area of their event horizons rather than to their volume. The finding was puzzling because it suggested that the information content of a black hole is determined by the two-dimensional surface that bounds it, rather than by the three-dimensional volume that the surface contains. Stephen Hawking's subsequent work on black hole radiation provided additional theoretical support for this framework, with the broader picture that emerged through Bekenstein and Hawking establishing the foundations of what has become contemporary research on the relationship between information, gravity, and space-time structure. Gerard Hooft and Leonard Susskind extended these findings in the 1990s to develop the broader holographic principle, with the principle holding that the information content of any region of space is fully encoded on the two-dimensional boundary of that region. The framework has been developed through extensive subsequent research, with the implications for understanding how gravity operates and how it relates to other fundamental features of physical reality continuing to be worked out. The principle has been confirmed through various theoretical investigations, including the ADS CFT correspondence that we will examine, but the principle remains controversial in some of its specific applications. The implications of the holographic principle for understanding consciousness are striking. If the information content of three-dimensional regions of space is encoded on their two-dimensional boundaries, with gravity being the mechanism through which this encoding operates, then consciousness may be involving informational structures that exceed what the merely three-dimensional framework would suggest. The conscious experience that you have right now, with its rich informational content involving multiple modalities of perception and cognition, may be participating in the holographic encoding that the framework articulates. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications to consciousness, but the framework provides a precise vocabulary within which the relationship between consciousness, information, and gravity can be formulated in ways that exceed what the merely local framework allows. The work of Juan Maldacena on the ADS CFT correspondence has provided one of the most striking developments in the holographic principle research. The correspondence, articulated in his 1997 paper that has been one of the most cited papers in theoretical physics, demonstrates a specific mathematical equivalence between a gravitational theory in a certain kind of space-time and a quantum field theory without gravity on the boundary of that space-time. The framework has substantial implications for understanding how gravity operates and how it might relate to other fundamental features of physical reality, including potentially consciousness. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications to consciousness, but the framework provides one of the most precise mathematical foundations within which these questions can be formulated. The implications of the ADS-CFT correspondence for understanding consciousness, while not the primary focus of Maldaceno's technical work, have been explored by various subsequent researchers. The correspondence suggests that gravitational phenomena in higher dimensional spaces can be equivalent to non-gravitational phenomena on the boundary of those spaces, with the equivalence being one of the most striking results in contemporary theoretical physics. If consciousness involves gravitational mechanisms, as the Penrose-Hameroff framework suggests, then the conscious experience that we recognize from our position within the universe may have an equivalent description in terms of non-gravitational phenomena on some boundary structure that our position prevents us from directly accessing. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications to consciousness, but the framework provides resources for thinking about why consciousness has the specific features it has that the merely local framework cannot provide. The work of Carlo Rovelli on loop quantum gravity, which we considered briefly in the earlier stage of the inquiry, provides another framework within which the relationship between gravity and consciousness can be reformulated. Loop quantum gravity, developed across decades of research by Rovelli and various other physicists, treats spacetime itself as being constituted by discrete quantum events at the deepest level, rather than as a continuous background within which other quantum phenomena occur. The framework provides resources for thinking about how gravity, quantum mechanics, and consciousness might all be related at the deepest level of physical reality. The framework treats gravity not as an additional phenomenon that must be quantized separately from other quantum phenomena, but as the geometric structure that emerges from the more fundamental quantum events that constitute spacetime itself. The implications of loop quantum gravity for consciousness, while not Rovelli's primary concern in his technical work, are substantial. If spacetime itself is constituted by discrete quantum events, and if consciousness is associated with quantum processes that involve gravitational reduction, as the Penrose-Hameroff framework suggests, then consciousness may be participating in the very processes through which spacetime is constituted, rather than being merely located within a pre-existing spacetime. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications to consciousness, but it provides a context within which the relationship between gravity and consciousness can be formulated in ways that exceed what the merely classical framework allows. The work of David Bohm on the implicate order, which we have considered in earlier inquiries on different topics, provides additional resources that bear on the questions about gravity and consciousness. Bohm's framework, articulated most fully in his 1980 book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, proposes that the physical reality we ordinarily encounter is an unfolding of a deeper underlying reality through processes that operate according to specific structural principles. The implicate order is, on the framework, the level at which information is distributed across the entire system, with specific manifestations in the explicate order being the unfoldings of patterns that exist in compressed form at the deeper level. Bohm developed the framework in part through engagement with the conceptual problems of quantum mechanics, and in part through engagement with the conceptual problems of relativity and gravity, with the broader framework that emerged providing one of the most sophisticated philosophical responses to the difficulties of integrating quantum mechanics with gravitational physics. The application of Bohm's framework to the question of how consciousness relates to gravity is direct. If consciousness is associated with quantum processes that operate at the boundary between the implicate and explicate orders, and if gravity is the structural feature that organizes the unfolding from the implicate to the explicate, then consciousness may be participating in the same fundamental process that organizes the gravitational structure of space-time. The framework treats consciousness not as a separate phenomenon that emerges within the explicate order, but as a feature of the fundamental process by which the explicate order is generated from the implicate. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications, but the framework provides one of the most philosophically sophisticated alternatives to the merely materialist account of how consciousness relates to fundamental physical structure. Bohm's specific articulation of the hollow movement, the fundamental movement of which the explicate order is a manifestation, provides additional resources for thinking about how gravity and consciousness might be related at the deepest level. The hollow movement is, on Bohm's framework, the continuous process through which the implicate order unfolds into the explicate order, and the explicate order enfolds back into the implicate order, with the process being the very basis of physical reality, rather than something that occurs within a pre-existing physical framework. The implications for understanding gravity follow from the broader framework. Gravity may be, on this framework, not merely a force that operates on objects within space-time, but a feature of the very hollow movement through which space-time itself is generated. The implications for understanding consciousness follow from the same framework. Consciousness may be, on this framework, the means by which the hollow movement becomes aware of itself, with the awareness being one of the principal modes through which the fundamental process expresses itself within the explicate order. The convergence between Bohm's framework and the contemporary physics of holographic principles is striking. Both frameworks treat reality as fundamentally non-local at the deepest level, with the local appearances that ordinary experience encounters being unfoldings of patterns that exist in distributed form at the deeper level. The convergence has not been worked out in complete technical detail, with substantial questions remaining about how the specific frameworks relate to each other. But the convergence is real, and the implications for understanding how gravity, information, and consciousness are related at the deepest level continue to motivate research at the intersection of physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. The work of Lisa Randall at Harvard University on extra dimensions provides yet another framework within which the relationship between gravity and consciousness can be reformulated. Randall's work, articulated for general readers in her book Warped Passages, addresses the puzzling weakness of gravity compared to the other fundamental forces. The framework proposes that gravity may be weak in our observed universe, because much of its strength is distributed across extra dimensions that we cannot directly observe, with the framework providing a sophisticated theoretical foundation for various extensions of standard physics. The implications for consciousness, while not Randall's primary concern, are interesting. If gravity operates across extra dimensions that we cannot directly access, and if consciousness involves gravitational mechanisms as the Penrose-Hameroff framework suggests, then consciousness may be participating in physical processes that extend across dimensions beyond the merely three-dimensional space that ordinary experience accesses. The specific framework that Randall and her collaborator Raman Sundram developed, often called the Randall-Sundram model, proposes specific mathematical structures within which the extra dimensions can be characterized. The framework has been one of the more influential theoretical contributions to contemporary physics, with the implications for various open questions in the field continuing to be worked out. The implications for consciousness remain speculative, but the framework provides resources for thinking about why consciousness has specific features that the merely three-dimensional framework cannot adequately address. The convergence between the various frameworks that we have examined, including the Penrose-Hameroff, holographic, Bohm implicate order, Aharonov retrocausality, and Randall extra dimensions frameworks, suggests that the relationship between consciousness and the deepest structures of physical reality is more sophisticated than any single framework can fully capture. There is a particular set of claims that has been made in popular literature on the relationship between gravity and consciousness that deserves explicit examination because it has been the source of substantial confusion and substantial commercial exploitation. The claims involve the proposition that consciousness exerts a gravitational pull on the physical world through what has been called the law of attraction, with the implication being that the sufferer can use their conscious intentions to attract specific outcomes through gravitational mechanisms that the popular framework imagines. These claims have appeared in various books, films, online courses, and broader cultural movements that have presented themselves as bringing scientific evidence to bear on questions about how consciousness affects physical reality. The claims have to be addressed directly because they distort what the actual research establishes, and because they have shaped popular understanding of these topics in ways that exceed what the science supports. The most widely promoted version of these claims appeared in the 2006 book and film The Secret by Rhonda Byrne, with the framework being articulated through what was presented as the law of attraction. The framework holds that the conscious thoughts of an individual produce gravitational or vibrational effects that attract corresponding circumstances into their life, with positive thoughts attracting positive circumstances and negative thoughts attracting negative circumstances. The framework has been applied to questions ranging from financial success to romantic relationships to physical health, with the implication being that those who fail to achieve desired outcomes have failed to maintain the appropriate conscious intentions. The framework has had substantial cultural influence, with subsequent books, courses, and broader cultural movements continuing to develop the framework in various directions. The careful position requires distinguishing what the actual research establishes from what the popular claims have added. The contemporary research on consciousness that we have examined has established that consciousness may involve gravitational mechanisms at the fundamental level of physical reality, with the mechanisms operating through specific quantum processes in microtubules within neurons. The contemporary physics has established that gravity operates as the curvature of space-time structure across all of physical reality. The combination of these recognitions has been seized upon by popularizers to develop frameworks that treat consciousness as exerting gravitational pull on external circumstances through specific mental techniques. The frameworks have no support in the actual physics or the actual neuroscience. The specific reasons for rejecting these popular claims deserve examination because the rejection is not merely a matter of skeptical caution, but follows from specific features of the actual physics. The gravitational effects that the Penrose-Hameroff framework identifies operate at the scale of individual neurons and individual quantum reductions, with the effects being internal to the conscious system, rather than reaching out to external circumstances. The gravitational mechanism that the framework identifies operates through the space-time curvature produced by the energy distributions associated with quantum superposition states, with the curvature being localized rather than extending into the broader environment in the way that the popular framework would require. The decoherence problem documented by Max Tegmark applies equally here. The macroscopic conditions that would be required for conscious intentions to produce gravitational effects on external circumstances are precisely the conditions that prevent the maintenance of the kind of coherent quantum states that any such effects would require. The specific scale of the gravitational effects that conscious processes can produce deserves quantitative consideration, because the quantitative analysis decisively refutes the popular framework. The gravitational effect of any specific mass-energy distribution is determined by the standard physics of general relativity, with the effects scaling in specific ways that the popular framework ignores. The total mass energy associated with the neural activity of a human brain is approximately the same as the mass energy of the brain itself, which is approximately 1 to 2 kilograms. The gravitational effect of 1 to 2 kilograms of mass on objects at any significant distance is so small that it cannot be detected by any practical measurement, with the effect on objects at the distance of typical environmental targets being orders of magnitude smaller than the gravitational effects of nearby small objects like loose change in pockets or moving vehicles. The popular framework that treats conscious thoughts as exerting significant gravitational pull on external circumstances confuses the technical fact that all mass energy produces gravitational effects with the false claim that conscious thoughts produce significant gravitational effects on relevant external systems. The popular framework that treats consciousness as exerting gravitational pull on external circumstances has been particularly damaging in clinical and financial contexts. The framework has been used to suggest that those who suffer chronic illness, financial difficulty, or other persistent problems are responsible for their circumstances through their inadequate conscious intentions, with the implications for vulnerable people being substantial. The framework has been used to delay or replace evidence-based treatment in favor of mental practices that have no documented therapeutic effect, with the consequences for those who follow this advice having included worsening of treatable conditions. The framework has been used to extract substantial financial resources from vulnerable people through courses and programs that promise transformation through the application of the framework, with the documented harm to those who have invested in such programs being substantial. The honest acknowledgement is that the framework is not merely theoretically confused, but has produced substantial real-world harm in the people who have adopted it uncritically. The specific patterns of harm that the popular framework has produced deserve direct examination because the patterns continue to operate and continue to affect vulnerable people. The framework has been applied to cancer patients with the implication that their cancer follows from their inadequate conscious intentions, with the documented consequences, in some cases having included the rejection of evidence-based treatment in favor of visualization practices and the progression of treatable cancers to incurable stages. The framework has been applied to victims of violence with the implication that the violence followed from their inadequate conscious intentions, with the documented consequences having included additional psychological harm to victims who were already suffering. The framework has been applied to those experiencing financial difficulty with the implication that their difficulty follows from their inadequate conscious intentions, with the documented consequences having included the rejection of practical financial advice in favor of visualization practices that produced no actual financial benefits. The harm is real and continuing, and the careful inquiry into the relationship between consciousness and gravity has to acknowledge this harm rather than dismissing it as merely theoretical. The careful position is not the dismissal of all engagement with consciousness or with the question of how consciousness relates to physical reality. The contemplative traditions that we will examine in the next stage of the inquiry provide substantial resources for engaging with consciousness, with the engagement being grounded in moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary physics provides sophisticated frameworks for thinking about how consciousness and gravity might be related, with the frameworks being grounded in serious research rather than in commercial exploitation. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has been established by careful research and traditional practice from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. A related popular framework that deserves caution is the broader claim that thoughts have gravitational pull in some literal physical sense. The claim, articulated in various popular books and online materials, holds that the thoughts of conscious beings produce gravitational effects that propagate through space and affect distant physical systems and other conscious beings. The claim has no support in the actual physics. The gravitational effects of any specific thought, calculated using the standard physics of mass energy equivalence and gravitational interaction, are far below any conceivable threshold for influence on external systems. The popular framework that treats thoughts as having significant gravitational effects on external circumstances confuses the technical sense in which all energy and matter produce gravitational effects with the kind of significant influence that the popular framework imagines. The careful position recognizes the technical fact that all energy distributions, including those associated with neural activity, produce gravitational effects, while also recognizing that these effects are completely negligible on any scale that would matter for the popular framework's predictions. The position that has been articulated by David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and other contemporary philosophers concerning the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate provides a complementary framework for thinking about the relationship between gravity and consciousness. If consciousness is, as the various proto-panpsychist positions suggest, a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations, then consciousness and gravity may be related at the most fundamental level of physical reality, rather than being merely contingently connected through specific biological mechanisms. The framework provides resources for thinking about why consciousness has the specific features it has, with the qualitative character of conscious experience and the felt unity of consciousness being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but it provides a precise philosophical vocabulary within which the questions about gravity and consciousness can be formulated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The specific contribution that Chalmers's work has made to these questions has been the rigorous articulation of why the materialist framework faces fundamental difficulties in accounting for the qualitative character of conscious experience. The hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers articulated it in his 1995 paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies and developed in his subsequent book, The Conscious Mind, identifies the gap between any physical description of brain processes and the subjective experience that the processes seem to produce. The implications for understanding the relationship between gravity and consciousness follow from the broader framework. If consciousness cannot be reductively explained through any physical description, then the relationship between consciousness and gravity must involve something more than the merely causal influence that the materialist framework would describe. The framework does not by itself establish what this something more involves, but the framework provides a context within which the question can be formulated rigorously rather than dismissed. The work of Galen Strawson on what he calls realistic monism, articulated in his 2006 paper of the same name and developed in subsequent publications, provides complementary resources for thinking about gravity and consciousness. Strawson's framework holds that any genuine physicalism must include consciousness as a fundamental feature of physical reality, rather than treating consciousness as an emergent product of arrangements of allegedly non-conscious matter. The implications for the relationship between gravity and consciousness follow from the broader framework. If consciousness is fundamental, then consciousness and gravity may be related as different aspects of the same fundamental reality, with both being features of the deeper structure that physical theory and consciousness studies are converging to describe. The convergence of these various frameworks on the recognition that the deepest structure of reality involves features that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately capture provides a context within which the documented phenomena of consciousness and gravity can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The frameworks do not establish any specific account of how gravity and consciousness are related as the correct account. The frameworks establish that the materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics and philosophy of mind rule out any deeper account of the relationship between consciousness and gravity, is not actually supported by careful examination. The principles of physics and philosophy, properly understood, are consistent with deeper accounts that the contemplative traditions have articulated. But the consistency is not equivalent to demonstration, and the strongest forms of the alternative accounts remain speculative even as they are framed within the rigorous physics and philosophy that have been established. The careful position with respect to all of these frameworks is to recognize what they offer and what they do not offer for the inquiry into gravity and consciousness. They offer alternatives to the materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion, with the alternatives being grounded in serious physics and philosophy. They do not offer definitive answers to the questions about how gravity and consciousness are actually related, with the questions remaining open in ways that current research is working to address. They provide a context within which the contemplative traditions, which have addressed these questions across thousands of years, can be engaged seriously rather than dismissed as merely the products of pre-scientific thinking. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own different vocabularies recognitions about the relationship between consciousness and the fundamental forces of reality that the contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. The next stage of the inquiry will examine these traditional articulations in detail, with the recognition that the traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and that the convergence between them is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about what consciousness actually is and how it relates to the deepest forces of physical reality. Long before any laboratory could measure the gravitational reductions in microtubules or any framework existed for thinking about the holographic principle, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally parallel pictures of how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces that constitute reality. The methods used were not measurement and theory in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to the relationship between consciousness and the deeper forces that operate within and around conscious experience, to the contemplative practices that engage these forces directly, and to the philosophical reflection on what consciousness must be if it is the kind of thing that the traditions have observed it to be, across thousands of years of careful examination. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that consciousness is not merely a feature of biological systems that operates within a pre-existing physical reality, but is connected to the fundamental forces of attraction that constitute reality at its deepest level. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document about the relationship between gravity and consciousness is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought, and the deeper inquiry that follows requires careful engagement with what each major tradition has articulated. The most philosophically sophisticated treatment of gravity as a metaphor for the relationship between consciousness and reality appears in the Christian tradition through the work of Augustine of Hippo. The 13th book of the Confessions contains one of the most distinctive articulations of this theme, with Augustine developing his famous statement that his weight is his love. The framework that Augustine articulates treats love as the gravitational pull that draws the soul toward its proper good, with the metaphor being more than merely metaphorical in Augustine's own conception. Augustine understood that bodies have weight that pulls them toward their natural places, with stones falling toward the earth, fire rising toward the heavens, and water finding its proper level through the gravitational forces that operate on each. The framework treats the spiritual pull of love as participating in the same fundamental structural reality as physical gravity, with both being expressions of the deeper order that draws everything toward its proper place. The specific passage in the Confessions deserves careful attention because of its philosophical depth. Augustine writes that his weight is his love, and that wherever he is carried, his love carries him. The framework treats love as the operative force in the soul's movement, with the soul being drawn toward what it loves, just as physical bodies are drawn toward what attracts them gravitationally. The framework has been developed by subsequent Christian thinkers across more than 15 centuries, with the broader tradition that has emerged providing resources for thinking about the relationship between consciousness and the fundamental forces that the merely materialist framework cannot offer. The convergence between Augustine's framework and the contemporary Penrose Hameroff framework, despite the profound differences in their methods and contexts, is one of the more striking convergences in the broader history of human thought about consciousness and physical force. Augustine's framework was developed within the broader context of his engagement with the Platonic tradition that he had encountered through Neoplatonist sources. The Platonic recognition that the soul is drawn toward the good through what amounts to a gravitational pull had been articulated across the earlier philosophical tradition, with Plato himself in dialogues, including the Symposium and the Republic, articulating versions of this recognition. Augustine integrated the Platonic framework with the Christian theological framework of his own time, with the integration producing one of the most influential treatments of how consciousness relates to the fundamental forces of attraction within the entire Western tradition. The framework has continued to influence subsequent Christian thinking across more than 15 centuries, with the broader tradition that has emerged including the works of Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, and various other major thinkers. The work of Bonaventure, the 13th century Franciscan philosopher and theologian, whose Itinerarium Mentis in Deum has been one of the most influential works in the Christian mystical tradition, developed the Augustinian framework with particular attention to how the soul's gravitational movement toward God can be cultivated through contemplative practice. The framework that Bonaventure articulated treats the contemplative life as the disciplined engagement with the gravitational pull that draws the soul toward its proper good, with the engagement being one of the central concerns of the spiritual life. The framework has continued to be influential within Catholic theology and within the broader tradition of contemplative Christianity, with the broader picture that emerges providing resources for understanding how the gravitational metaphor that Augustine had developed can be applied within the actual practice of conscious life. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the same period as Bonaventure, addressed these themes within his broader theological framework with characteristic philosophical precision. Aquinas' treatment of the natural inclination of all things toward their proper good, articulated across his Summa Theologiae and various other works, integrated the Aristotelian framework of natural teleology with the broader Christian theological framework. The framework treats the gravitational pull that operates on physical bodies as one specific manifestation of the broader principle that all things tend toward their natural ends, with the spiritual movement of conscious beings toward their proper good being another manifestation of the same fundamental principle. The framework has been developed extensively across subsequent Catholic theology, with the broader picture that emerges providing one of the most sophisticated traditional treatments of how consciousness and physical force are related. The work of Dante Alighieri, the 14th century Italian poet whose Divine Comedy has been one of the most influential works in the entire Christian tradition, provides one of the most striking poetic articulations of the gravitational metaphor that Augustine had developed. The final canto of the Paradiso, the third part of the Divine Comedy, concludes with the famous line that identifies the love that moves the sun and the other stars. The framework that Dante articulates treats love as the gravitational force that operates throughout the cosmos, with the same love that moves the celestial bodies being the love that moves the human soul toward its proper destination. The framework integrates the gravitational metaphor with the broader theological framework of medieval Christianity, with the integration producing one of the most influential treatments of how consciousness and cosmic force are related in the entire Western tradition. The specific structure of the Paradiso, with its movement through the various celestial spheres organized according to the medieval cosmological framework, embodies the gravitational metaphor across the entire narrative. The journey of the soul through the spheres of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and the primum mobile, before arriving at the empyrean beyond physical reality, traces the path of the gravitational pull that draws conscious beings toward their proper destination. The framework treats the physical organization of the cosmos as participating in the same fundamental gravitational structure as the spiritual movement of conscious beings, with the integration providing one of the most sophisticated, traditional articulations of how physical force and conscious experience are related. The Dante framework has continued to influence Western thinking about these questions across more than 7 centuries since its composition, with the broader tradition that has emerged providing resources for understanding how consciousness and the fundamental forces of physical reality are related. The work of Maximus the Confessor, the 7th century Byzantine Christian theologian, whose contributions to Christian thinking on these themes have been substantial, articulated a framework within which all of creation moves toward its proper destination through what amounts to a gravitational pull. The framework that Maximus developed treats the various movements of physical bodies and conscious beings as participating in the same fundamental movement toward divine reality, with the participation being the means by which the broader purpose of creation is fulfilled. The framework has continued to influence Eastern Christian thinking on these questions, with the broader tradition that has emerged providing resources for understanding how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces that operate throughout creation. The convergence between Maximus's framework and the Augustinian framework that we have examined demonstrates the breadth of the Christian engagement with these questions across centuries and across the various Christian traditions. The Islamic tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding the gravitational pull that draws consciousness toward its proper relationship with divine reality. The Arabic and Turkish concept of kazaib, often translated as attraction or magnetic pull, has been developed across the Sufi tradition with particular sophistication. The framework treats the spiritual pull that draws the soul toward divine reality as participating in the same fundamental structural reality as physical attraction, with both being expressions of the deeper order that operates throughout creation. The framework has been articulated across centuries of Sufi practice, with the specific formulations varying across the different orders, but the underlying recognition being consistent. The Persian Sufi poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, whose Mesnevi has been one of the most widely read poetic works in the Islamic world, addressed the kazibe of divine reality across his vast corpus with characteristic depth. The famous opening of the Mesnevi, with its image of the reed flute cut from the reed bed and crying for its origin, captures one of the most distinctive Sufi articulations of how consciousness is drawn toward its source through what amounts to a gravitational pull. The framework treats the separation from the source as the very condition that produces the longing through which the gravitational pull operates, with the longing being itself the means by which the consciousness moves toward its proper destination. The framework has continued to shape Turkish religious sensibility across more than 7 centuries, with Rumi's specific articulations providing one of the most influential treatments of how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces of attraction. The specific structure of the reed flute metaphor deserves careful attention because of its philosophical depth. The reed is cut from the reed bed where it grew, with the cutting being the separation from the source that produces the subsequent longing. The cut reed becomes the flute, with the holes that allow it to produce music being the very wounds that the cutting produced. The music that the flute produces is the song of longing for the reed bed, with the longing being communicated through the very holes that the separation produced. The framework treats the embodied condition of conscious beings as analogous to the cut reed, with the consciousness having been separated from its source through the very embodiment that produces specific conscious experience. The longing that this separation produces is, on the framework, the gravitational pull that draws consciousness back toward its source, with the cultivation of awareness of this longing being one of the central concerns of the spiritual life. Rumi's broader engagement with the gravitational pull of divine reality across his vast corpus addresses the various manifestations of this pull that conscious existence encounters. The framework that Rumi articulates treats the various forms of love that conscious beings experience as participations in the same fundamental love that draws the soul toward divine reality, with the human loves being lower intensity manifestations of the same gravitational force that operates at the highest level of reality. The framework has parallels with the Christian articulations that we examined earlier, with both the Sufi and the Christian traditions arriving at structurally parallel positions despite their substantial theological differences. The convergence between these traditions on the recognition that consciousness participates in fundamental forces of attraction is one of the more striking patterns that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The specific Sufi practice of Sima, the whirling that has come to be associated particularly with the Mevlevi order that developed around Rumi's teachings, embodies the gravitational pull in concrete bodily form. The practitioner who performs the Sima rotates around a central axis while moving in a broader circular pattern around the space, with the movement embodying the relationship between the local self and the broader gravitational pull that operates throughout the cosmos. The practice has been developed across more than 7 centuries of Mevlevi tradition, with the specific forms varying across the different schools but the underlying recognition being consistent. The framework treats the bodily practice as one of the means by which the practitioner cultivates awareness of and engagement with the gravitational pull that operates at the deepest level of reality. The work of Ibn Arabi, the 12th and 13th century Andalusian Sufi philosopher, whose contributions to Islamic mystical philosophy have been substantial, developed the framework of cosmic attraction with characteristic philosophical sophistication. Ibn Arabi's doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, holds that all of reality is ultimately one substance that manifests in various forms, with the various forms being held in their proper relationships through the gravitational pull of the fundamental unity. The framework provides resources for understanding why consciousness has the specific features it has, with the consciousness being the means by which the fundamental unity becomes aware of itself within specific localized regions. The framework has been controversial across subsequent Islamic philosophy, but the framework has continued to influence thinking about these questions across centuries. Ibn Arabi's specific articulation of how the divine reality is reflected in the various creatures provides additional resources for thinking about how consciousness relates to the fundamental forces of attraction. The framework treats each creature as a specific manifestation of the divine names and attributes, with the manifestation being the means by which the divine reality becomes recognizable within the specific creature. The implications for understanding consciousness follow from the broader framework. Consciousness is, on Ibn Arabi's framework, the principal mode through which the divine reality becomes aware of itself within the various creatures, with the awareness being one of the central purposes for which the creation exists. The framework remains controversial within the broader Islamic philosophical tradition, but the framework has continued to influence Sufi thinking across more than 7 centuries since its articulation. The work of Yunus Emre, the 13th and 14th century Turkish Sufi poet whose verses have shaped Turkish religious sensibility across centuries, articulated the engagement with divine attraction with characteristic accessibility and depth. The recurring themes in his poetry of the soul's movement toward its proper destination, of the longing that operates as the gravitational force through which this movement occurs, and of the spiritual practices that cultivate the appropriate orientation toward the divine reality, capture recognitions that have resonated across centuries of Turkish religious life. The continuing influence of Yunus Emre's verses across contemporary Turkish religious culture demonstrates the enduring relevance of these frameworks for thinking about how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces of attraction. The work of Said Nursi, the 20th century Turkish Islamic scholar whose Risale-i Nur collection has been one of the most influential works of modern Islamic thought, developed the concept of cosmic attraction with particular attention to its specific manifestations in the structure of physical reality. Nursi's treatment of the mizan, the cosmic balance that operates throughout creation, articulates a framework within which the various forces that operate in physical reality, including gravity, are understood as expressions of the deeper divine order that operates through all things. The framework has been controversial in some respects, but the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between physical force and divine reality that has shaped contemporary Turkish religious thinking. The integration of Nursi's framework with the broader Sufi tradition's recognition of Kazib demonstrates the continuing development of these themes within Islamic thought into the modern period. The Hadith tradition within Islamic literature contains numerous specific teachings about how God draws conscious beings toward divine reality through what amounts to a gravitational pull. The famous Hadith Qudsi, in which God is said to declare that whoever approaches God by a handspan will be approached by an arm length, and whoever approaches walking will be approached running, articulates a framework within which the gravitational pull operates, not as an impersonal force, but as a relational dynamic between consciousness and divine reality. The framework has been developed across the Islamic tradition with particular attention to how the cultivation of the appropriate disposition toward divine reality intensifies the gravitational pull that draws consciousness toward its proper destination. The framework has substantial parallels with the Christian articulations of grace and divine initiative that we examined earlier, with the cross-traditional convergence on the relational character of the gravitational pull being one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The Hindu tradition has articulated its own framework for understanding the gravitational pull that operates between consciousness and divine reality through the concept of akasana, attraction, that appears in various forms across the broader Hindu philosophical tradition. The framework treats the various forces that draw conscious beings toward their proper destinations as manifestations of the same fundamental attraction that operates throughout reality, with the different specific applications being context-dependent expressions of the same underlying principle. The framework has been developed extensively across the various Hindu schools, with the specific formulations differing but the underlying recognition being consistent. The Bhagavad Gita addresses the gravitational pull of divine reality at multiple points across its 18 chapters, with the 7th chapter providing one of the most concentrated treatments. The teaching that Krishna delivers about how all conscious beings are drawn toward divine reality through the various paths that are appropriate to their specific natures articulates a framework within which the gravitational pull operates, differently for different beings, while remaining the same fundamental force. The framework has been the foundation of substantial subsequent practice within Hindu spiritual life, with the implications for how consciousness can be cultivated to respond appropriately to the gravitational pull being significant. The Bhakti devotional tradition within Hinduism has developed the gravitational metaphor with particular sophistication. The framework treats the longing of the devotee for the divine reality as participating in the same gravitational force that draws all of creation toward its proper destination, with the devotional practices being the means by which this gravitational pull is cultivated and intensified. The work of Chaitanya, the 15th and 16th century Bengali religious teacher, whose articulation of the Bhakti tradition has been one of the most influential in Indian religious history, treats the magnetic pull of the divine reality as one of the central concerns of the spiritual life. The framework has continued to be developed across the various Bhakti traditions, with the broader picture that emerges, providing resources for understanding how consciousness can be cultivated to respond appropriately to the gravitational forces that operate at the deepest level of reality. The specific Chaitanya tradition that developed in Bengal articulated the gravitational metaphor through the concept of bhava, the emotional disposition of the devotee toward divine reality. The framework treats the cultivation of specific emotional dispositions, including the dispositions of servant toward master, friend toward friend, parent toward child, and lover toward beloved, as different modes through which the gravitational pull of divine reality can be engaged. The framework has been controversial within the broader Hindu philosophical tradition, with various critics arguing that the framework places excessive emphasis on emotional engagement at the expense of philosophical analysis. But the framework has continued to influence Bengali religious life across centuries, with the broader tradition providing resources for understanding how consciousness can be cultivated through specific practices that engage the gravitational forces that operate at the deepest level of reality. The work of Ramanuja, the 11th and 12th century Indian philosopher whose Vishishtadvaita framework has been one of the most influential developments within Hindu philosophy, addresses these themes with characteristic philosophical sophistication. Ramanuja's framework holds that the relationship between conscious beings and divine reality is genuinely relational, with the gravitational pull operating between distinct entities rather than dissolving the distinctions between them. The framework has been controversial within the broader Hindu philosophical tradition, particularly in its disagreements with the Advaita Vedanta framework that emphasizes the non-dual unity of reality, but the framework has continued to influence subsequent Hindu thinking. The convergence between Ramanuja's relational framework and various aspects of the Christian and Islamic frameworks that we have examined is one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The Buddhist tradition has articulated its own framework for understanding how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces of attraction through the doctrine of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. The framework holds that all phenomena arise in mutual dependence with all other phenomena, with no phenomenon having an independent existence apart from its relationships with the conditions that produce it. The framework provides resources for thinking about how consciousness is connected to the broader structure of reality, with the connections being expressions of the deeper interdependence that the framework articulates. The framework has parallels with the contemporary recognition that consciousness may involve gravitational mechanisms that connect it to the deepest structures of space-time, with the convergence between the Buddhist framework and the contemporary physics being one of the more interesting patterns that emerges from the comparative study of these questions. The metaphor of Indra's net, articulated in the Avatamsaka Sutra and developed extensively in the Huayan school of Mahayana Buddhism, provides one of the most evocative articulations of the dependent origination framework. The metaphor presents reality as an infinite net of jewels, with each jewel reflecting all the other jewels and being reflected in all of them. The image captures the recognition that no phenomenon exists in isolation, with each phenomenon participating in the totality of reality through its relationships with all other phenomena. The implications for understanding consciousness within this framework are direct. Consciousness is, on the framework, not a localized phenomenon that occurs within an isolated being, but is a participation in the broader network of relationships that constitutes reality at its deepest level. The Huayan school of Mahayana Buddhism, which developed in China during the Tang dynasty, articulated the implications of the Indra's net metaphor with substantial philosophical sophistication. The school's central doctrine of the interpenetration of all phenomena holds that each phenomenon contains all other phenomena within itself, with the containing being possible through the mutual reflection that the dual net metaphor articulates. The framework provides resources for thinking about how consciousness relates to the broader structure of reality, with the consciousness being one of the principal modes through which the interpenetration becomes recognizable within specific localized regions. The framework has continued to influence East Asian Buddhist thinking across more than 1,000 years since its development, with the broader picture that emerges providing one of the most sophisticated traditional articulations of how consciousness participates in the fundamental connections that operate throughout reality. The convergence between the Indra's net metaphor and the contemporary holographic principle is striking. Both frameworks treat reality as fundamentally interconnected at the deepest level, with each part containing information about the whole, and the whole being reflected in each part. The convergence is not equivalence, with the specific frameworks of the Buddhist tradition and contemporary physics remaining distinct. But the structural parallels are real, and the implications for understanding how consciousness participates in the deepest structures of reality continue to be developed at the intersection of these traditions. The work of Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Indian Buddhist philosopher whose contributions to Mahayana philosophy have been among the most influential in the entire Buddhist tradition, addressed the doctrine of dependent origination with characteristic philosophical rigor. Nagarjuna's analysis emphasized that the apparent independent existence of phenomena is itself an illusion produced by the cognitive habits that ordinary perception sustains, with a deeper recognition of dependent origination, dissolving the apparent independence and revealing the broader interconnection. The framework provides resources for understanding why consciousness can have access to features of reality that extend beyond the apparent boundaries of the individual conscious being, with the access being a consequence of the deeper interconnection that the framework articulates, rather than the operation of any specific mechanism that operates between apparently separate beings. The Taoist tradition has articulated its own framework for understanding how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces of attraction through the concept of the Tao itself. The Tao is, on the Taoist articulation, the natural way of all things that operates as the gravitational principle through which everything moves toward its proper destination. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi and composed in the 6th century before the Common Era or earlier, articulates the foundational understanding within which the Tao operates as the structural principle that organizes the movements of all phenomena, including consciousness itself. The framework treats the various forces that operate in physical reality as manifestations of the same fundamental Tao that operates throughout creation, with the wise person being the one who has cultivated the appropriate alignment with the Tao. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or non-coercive action, provides a practical framework within which the gravitational pull of the Tao can be engaged. The framework does not require the cessation of action or the withdrawal from engagement with the world. The framework requires the alignment of action with the natural flow of the Tao, with the alignment being the means by which the conscious being participates in the gravitational pull that operates at the deepest level. The implications for understanding consciousness are substantial. Consciousness is, on the Taoist framework, not separate from the gravitational pull of the Tao, but is the means by which the gravitational pull becomes aware of itself within specific, localized regions. The framework has been developed extensively across centuries of Taoist practice, with the broader picture that emerges providing resources for understanding how consciousness can be cultivated to respond appropriately to the fundamental forces of attraction. The Zhuangzi, the other foundational Taoist text composed in the 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era, develops these themes through extensive parables and philosophical reflections that illuminate how consciousness participates in the Tao. The framework treats consciousness as one of the principal modes through which the Tao expresses itself in the world, with the specific manifestations of conscious activity being the means by which the Tao becomes recognizable within specific contexts. The framework has continued to influence Chinese religious and philosophical thinking across more than 2,000 years, with the broader tradition that has emerged, providing resources for thinking about consciousness that exceed what merely materialist frameworks would allow. The specific parables that the Zhuangzi develops include the famous story of the butterfly dream, in which Zhuangzi describes dreaming that he was a butterfly and then waking to find himself a man, with the question being whether he is a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming he is a man. The parable captures the recognition that the apparent boundaries between different forms of conscious existence are less fixed than ordinary perception suggests, with the gravitational pull of the Tao operating across these apparent boundaries to maintain the unity of the broader process. The framework has been the subject of extensive subsequent commentary across the Taoist and broader Chinese philosophical traditions, with the implications for understanding how consciousness participates in the fundamental forces of reality being substantial. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context and theological commitment, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what contemporary research has begun to document about the relationship between consciousness and gravity. The traditions consistently treat consciousness as participating in fundamental forces of attraction that operate throughout reality. The traditions consistently distinguish between the surface manifestations of these forces in ordinary experience and the deeper structural reality that underlies these manifestations, with the distinction being important for understanding why the gravitational metaphor that the traditions employ is not merely metaphorical. The traditions consistently develop practices for the cultivation of appropriate engagement with these forces, with the practices ranging from the Christian contemplative life that we examine through Augustine and Bonaventure, to the Sufi Kazibe practices that Rumi articulated to the Hindu bhakti devotion that Chaitanya developed to the Buddhist meditation on dependent origination to the Taoist cultivation of Wu Wei. And the traditions consistently locate consciousness within broader frameworks of meaning that connect the individual conscious experience to the larger patterns of reality that the conscious existence participates in. The convergence is not equivalence. The Augustinian pondus is not the Sufi Kazibe, is not the Hindu Akasana, is not the Buddhist Pratityasamutpada, is not the Taoist Tao. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ, the metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that consciousness is connected to the fundamental forces of attraction that operate at the deepest level of reality, that the cultivation of appropriate engagement with these forces is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, and that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage seriously with what the traditions have been articulating across thousands of years. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these recognitions, taken together with the contemporary research that has been documenting the relationship between gravity and consciousness, suggest for how a person can inhabit the embodied existence in which consciousness is one of the principal modes through which the deepest forces of reality become manifest in specific conscious beings. The consciousness that you have right now, the conscious awareness that is recognizing these specific sentences as they appear, is not the merely emergent product of complex neural arrangements that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to consider it as. The consciousness has a physical basis that may involve the very gravitational mechanisms that shape spacetime itself, with the basis being articulated through the orchestrated objective reduction framework that Penrose and Hameroff have developed across decades of careful work. The consciousness participates in informational structures that the holographic principle articulates, in temporal structures that the block universe interpretation of relativity describes, and in non-local connections that David Bohm's implicate order framework addresses. The consciousness has been recognized across the great contemplative traditions as being drawn toward its proper relationship with the fundamental reality through what amounts to a gravitational pull, with the recognitions being articulated through the Augustinian pondus, the Sufi Kazibe, the Hindu Akasana, the Buddhist Pratityasamutpada, and the Taoist Tao, The consciousness is something more sophisticated than any of these specific frameworks alone can fully capture, with the convergence between the various frameworks providing the deepest picture of what consciousness actually involves. The synthesis that follows draws together the various strands of the inquiry. The synthesis is not the final word on questions that remain genuinely open. The synthesis is the recognition of what the convergent evidence suggests, of what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and of what specific implications follow for how a person can inhabit a life in which consciousness is one of the principal modes through which the deepest forces of reality become manifest. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist framework that has been the dominant position within mainstream neuroscience and philosophy of mind across the past several decades. The framework holds that consciousness is the emergent product of complex neural arrangements, with the emergence being the consequence of sufficient computational complexity rather than the consequence of any specific physical principle involving gravity or any other fundamental force. The framework has been articulated by various contemporary philosophers and neuroscientists, with the work of Daniel Dennett on consciousness as a kind of useful illusion being one of the most influential articulations. The framework has substantial empirical support in the various correlations between specific neural activities and specific conscious experiences that contemporary neuroscience has documented, with the correlations being interpreted within the framework as evidence that consciousness is identical to or reducible to the neural activities. The specific arguments that the materialist framework has developed deserve direct engagement because of their substantial empirical support. The neural correlates of consciousness that contemporary neuroscience has documented include specific patterns of neural activity that correspond reliably to specific conscious experiences, with the correlations being one of the most robust findings in the broader field. The work of Christoph Koch, the German-American neuroscientist whose contributions to consciousness research have been substantial, has documented numerous specific neural correlates with the precision that contemporary neuroscience can provide. The work of Stanislas Dehaene, the French neuroscientist whose research on the global neuronal workspace has been influential, has articulated frameworks within which the correlations between neural activity and conscious experience can be understood without invoking any quantum or gravitational mechanism. The materialist framework has substantial resources for accounting for the documented phenomena of consciousness without requiring the theoretical extensions that we have been examining throughout the inquiry. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist framework cannot be summarily dismissed. The neural correlates of consciousness are real correlates. The biological basis of conscious experience is increasingly characterized. The cognitive functions that consciousness accomplishes are well documented. What the inquiry has established is that the materialist framework does not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve. With the qualitative character of conscious experience, the unified binding of conscious experience, and the specific temporal structure of consciousness, all raising features that the merely materialist account does not adequately address. The position that consciousness is reducible to neural activity is not the established scientific consensus that some popular accounts have presented it as. The position is one available framework among several, with serious empirical and philosophical considerations that current research has not fully resolved. The second objection focuses on the speculative status of the philosophical extensions that we have considered. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, while supported by some recent empirical work including the Bandyopadhyay vibration findings and the Wiest 2024 anesthetic studies, remains controversial within the broader neuroscience community. The block universe interpretation of relativity, while technically correct as a mathematical framework, has not been established as the correct interpretation of the physical reality that relativity describes. The holographic principle, while well supported in its specific applications to black hole physics, remains controversial in its broader applications to physical reality more generally. The application of any of these frameworks to specific questions about consciousness involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. The honest acknowledgement is that the philosophical frameworks provide resources for thinking about consciousness beyond the materialist framework, but the frameworks do not by themselves establish that consciousness is what these frameworks suggest it might be. The third objection requires returning to the popular abuse of these themes in contemporary spiritual and self-help literature, given the substantial harm that such abuse has produced. The frameworks that treat consciousness as exerting gravitational pull on external circumstances through specific mental techniques have no support in either the actual physics or the actual neuroscience. The decoherence problem documented by Max Tegmark eliminates the kind of coherent macroscopic quantum states that any such effects would require. The gravitational mechanism that the Penrose-Hameroff framework identifies operates at the scale of individual neurons and individual quantum reductions, with the effects being internal to the conscious system rather than reaching out to external circumstances. The popular framework that the sufferer attracts their circumstances through the gravitational pull of their thoughts and can transform external reality through positive thinking is incompatible with both the actual physics and the actual circumstances of much human suffering. The framework has been used to dismiss the genuine suffering of those facing circumstances that no amount of correct thinking can change, with the documented consequences having included substantial real-world harm to vulnerable people who have adopted the framework uncritically. The careful position requires the explicit rejection of these popular frameworks while preserving the recognition that contemplative engagement with consciousness, conducted within the moral and spiritual seriousness of the actual contemplative traditions, has substantial value. The careful contemplative traditions that we have examined did not teach the manifestation framework in any of these forms. The Augustinian framework of Pondus teaches that the weight of love draws conscious beings toward their proper destination, but the framework does not teach that conscious beings can manipulate external circumstances through the gravitational pull of their thoughts. The Sufi framework of Kazibeh teaches that the divine attraction draws the soul toward its source, but the framework does not teach that the soul can manipulate the divine reality through specific techniques. The Hindu framework of Akasana teaches that the various paths through which conscious beings are drawn toward divine reality operate according to the deeper structural reality, but the framework does not teach that the conscious being can manipulate the structural reality through specific intentions. The Buddhist framework of Pratitya Samutpada teaches that all phenomena arise in mutual dependence, but the framework does not teach that conscious beings can manipulate the dependence through specific mental techniques. The Taoist framework of Tao teaches that the natural way operates through all phenomena, but the framework does not teach that conscious beings can manipulate the Tao through specific techniques. The popular distortions have abandoned the moral and spiritual seriousness of the actual traditions while retaining the surface vocabulary, with the abandonment being the source of the harm that the popular distortions have produced. The fourth objection concerns the related popular framework that treats thoughts as having literal gravitational pull on physical systems. The framework, articulated in various popular books and online materials, holds that the thoughts of conscious beings produce gravitational effects that propagate through space and affect distant physical systems and other conscious beings. The framework has been examined quantitatively in earlier stages of the inquiry. with the analysis demonstrating that the gravitational effects of any specific thought are far below any conceivable threshold for significant influence on external systems. The popular framework that treats thoughts as having significant gravitational effects on external circumstances confuses the technical fact that all energy and matter produce gravitational effects with the false claim that conscious thoughts produce significant gravitational effects on relevant external systems. The careful position recognizes the technical fact that all energy distributions, including those associated with neural activity, produce gravitational effects, while also recognizing that these effects are completely negligible on any scale that would matter for the popular framework's predictions. The fifth objection concerns the eliminativist materialist position that has been developed by various contemporary philosophers, including Paul and Patricia Churchland and various others. The framework holds that the apparent features of conscious experience that we have been examining throughout the inquiry, including the qualitative character of conscious experience and the unified binding of conscious experience, are themselves features of a folk psychology that should eventually be replaced by more rigorous neuroscientific descriptions. The framework treats the very phenomena that the inquiry has been examining as artifacts of pre-scientific thinking, rather than as genuine features of reality that require explanation. The framework has been controversial within philosophy of mind, but the framework articulates a specific challenge to the inquiry's broader approach that requires acknowledgement. The honest engagement with the eliminativist materialist position requires recognizing both what it offers and what it overlooks. The position offers a genuine theoretical commitment to taking neuroscience seriously and to not preserving features of folk psychology that may not survive scientific investigation. The position overlooks, in its strongest forms, the actual phenomena of conscious experience that motivate philosophical and contemplative engagement with these questions in the first place. The qualitative character of the experience that you are having right now, with its specific phenomenal features, is not adequately addressed by any framework that simply denies that such features exist. The framework remains controversial, but the framework does not actually undermine the inquiry's broader approach, because the framework fails to address the phenomena that the inquiry has been examining, rather than providing an alternative account of those phenomena. The sixth objection concerns the decoherence problem that we have considered at various points across the inquiry. The standard treatment of decoherence, articulated most fully in the work of Max Tegmark, holds that warm biological systems should not be capable of maintaining the kind of coherent quantum states that the Penrose Hameroff framework requires. The objection is technical but substantial, with the implications for the broader framework being significant. The Bandyopadhyay research has provided some empirical support for the maintenance of quantum coherence in microtubules under biological conditions, with the findings suggesting that specific structural features of microtubules may protect against decoherence in ways that the standard treatment had not anticipated. But the research has been controversial within mainstream physics, with substantial questions about the specific conditions under which the measurements were made remaining open. The honest acknowledgement is that the decoherence problem is a real problem that the Penrose Hameroff framework has to address, with the framework's success or failure depending substantially on whether the empirical findings continue to support the maintenance of quantum coherence under biological conditions. The seventh objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Augustinian Pondus, with its specific commitments about the relationship between human love and the love of God that draws all things toward their proper place, is not the same as the Sufi Kazib, with its specific commitments about the relationship between human longing and the divine attraction that draws the soul toward its source. The Hindu Akasana, with its specific commitments about the various paths through which conscious beings are drawn toward divine reality, is not the same as the Buddhist Pratityasamutpada, with its specific commitments about the dependent origination of all phenomena. The Taoist Tao, with its specific commitments about the natural way of all things, is not the same as any of the theistic frameworks that ground their treatments of gravitational pull in commitments about divine reality. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The neuroscience and physics document real phenomena that exceed what the simplest materialist framework allows. The philosophical extensions provide frameworks within which these phenomena can be understood without forcing them into the merely materialist mold. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of what consciousness actually is and what relationship it has with the fundamental forces of reality. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of science, philosophy, and tradition remain distinct, and the implications for how a person can understand the consciousness that constitutes their existence follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that consciousness involves orchestrated objective reductions in microtubules has direct implications for understanding what happens to consciousness at biological death. If consciousness is associated with quantum coherent states in microtubules, and if these states have features that exceed what the merely classical framework allows, then the question of what happens to these states when the biological substrate ceases to function becomes a question that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately address. The frameworks that contemporary research has developed for thinking about consciousness at death, taken together with the contemplative traditions that have addressed these questions across thousands of years, provide resources for engaging with the question of mortality that exceed what the merely physiological view can offer. The relationship between gravity, consciousness, and mortality is one of the deeper connections that the broader inquiry reveals. The specific implications for understanding death follow from the broader framework. If consciousness is constituted through gravitational reductions that operate at the deepest level of physical reality, and if these reductions involve informational structures that participate in the broader gravitational structure of spacetime, then the cessation of biological function may not represent the complete cessation of the consciousness that the biological function supported. The framework does not establish that consciousness persists after biological death in any specific form. The framework establishes that the question of what happens at death involves features that exceed the merely materialist framework's resources for addressing it, with the implications for how mortality should be engaged being substantial. The recognition that memory may involve features that exceed what the merely brain-based storage framework allows has direct connections to the gravity consciousness framework that we have been examining. The work of Carl Pribram and David Bohm on holographic models of memory, developed across decades of research, articulated frameworks within which memory involves distributed informational structures rather than localized neural storage. The convergence between these frameworks and the holographic principle in physics, and between both and the Penrose Hameroff framework for consciousness, suggests that memory and consciousness may both involve participation in informational structures that operate at the deepest level of physical reality. The implications for understanding why memory has the specific features it has, including the apparent capacity to access information that exceeds what local neural storage could account for, follow from the broader framework. The recognition that meaningful coincidences may have a structural basis that the standard frameworks cannot adequately address has connections to the gravity consciousness framework that we have been examining. If consciousness participates in the implicate order that Bohm articulated, and if meaningful coincidences are manifestations of the deeper informational structures that the implicate order organizes, then both consciousness and meaningful coincidences may be participating in the same fundamental structural reality. The framework provides resources for understanding why certain coincidences feel meaningful in ways that cannot be reduced to mere subjective interpretation, with the meaningfulness being a recognition of structural relationships that the deeper framework articulates. The recognition that suffering has structural features that exceed what the merely physiological framework allows has connections to the gravity consciousness framework. The Penrose-Hameroff framework's treatment of the binding problem provides resources for understanding why suffering has the specific unified character it has, with the binding being itself a feature of the orchestrated quantum reductions that the framework identifies. The implications for understanding why suffering operates as one of the principal modes through which conscious existence engages with reality at depths that pleasure and comfort cannot access follow from the broader framework. The relationship between gravity, consciousness, and suffering is one of the more difficult, but also one of the more illuminating connections that the broader inquiry reveals. The recognition that the bond between persons involves features that exceed what the merely psychological framework allows has direct connections to the gravity consciousness framework. The Augustinian pondus, the explicit recognition that love operates as the gravitational pull that draws conscious beings toward their proper relationships with others, and ultimately with the source of all relationships, captures the structural parallel between physical gravity and the bonds between conscious beings. The framework treats the bonds between persons as participating in the same fundamental gravitational reality that operates throughout the physical universe, with the participation being the means by which conscious existence becomes meaningful through specific relationships. The implications for how the bonds between persons should be understood are substantial. The specific connection between Augustine's articulation and the contemporary research deserves additional attention because of its philosophical depth. Augustine's recognition that his weight is his love is not merely a poetic flourish, but is a precise structural claim about how consciousness operates within the broader gravitational structure of reality. The love that draws conscious beings towards specific others, the love that draws conscious beings towards specific goods, and the love that draws conscious beings toward the source of all goods, all participate in the same fundamental gravitational reality that operates at the deepest level of physical structure. The framework treats love not as a merely psychological phenomenon, but as a participation in the fundamental forces that organize the cosmos. The convergence between Augustine's recognition and the contemporary research that we have been examining throughout the inquiry is one of the more striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about consciousness and physical reality. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests has direct connections to the gravity consciousness framework. The block universe interpretation of relativity, taken together with the Penrose-Hameroff framework's treatment of the moment-to-moment generation of consciousness, suggests that consciousness participates in temporal structures that exceed the merely sequential framework. If the past and future both exist with equal reality in the broader spacetime structure, and if consciousness involves orchestrated quantum reductions that may be constrained by both past and future boundary conditions, then consciousness may be participating in the very temporal structure that constitutes physical reality. The implications for thinking about the meaning of time across the entire span of an existence follow from the broader framework. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and the philosophical extensions, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of the inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to consciousness than the relationship that the standard cultural framework allows. The traditions have all developed practices that cultivate this different relationship, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as the means by which the recognition is transmitted from one generation of practitioners to the next. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of cultivation, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is the Augustinian practice of attending to what one's life is actually being drawn toward through the specific loves that operate within consciousness. The practice involves the regular examination of where the gravitational pull of one's actual life is taking one, with the recognition that the loves we cultivate are the weights that determine our destination. The practice does not require any specific religious commitment in the strong sense. The practice requires only the willingness to attend honestly to what one's actual loves are and what destination they are drawing one toward, with the cultivation of awareness of these gravitational pulls being one of the means through which the conscious life can be brought into alignment with what the deepest forces of reality are actually inviting one toward. The specific implementation of this practice in daily life can take various forms. The practice can involve regular periods of reflection on the activities and relationships that occupy substantial portions of one's attention, with the reflection identifying the actual loves that these activities and relationships represent. The practice can involve the recognition of where one's attention is drawn during unstructured moments, with the patterns of drawn attention revealing the gravitational pulls that operate within the conscious life. The practice can involve the periodic examination of what destination one's current trajectory is actually heading toward, with the examination providing resources for adjusting the trajectory if the actual destination is not the destination that conscious reflection would choose. The framework treats this examination not as moralistic judgment of one's loves, but as honest recognition of where the gravitational pulls are actually drawing the conscious life. A second practice draws on the Sufi tradition of Kazibe and the broader framework of cultivating awareness of the gravitational pull of divine reality. The practice involves the sustained attention to the longing that operates within consciousness, with the longing being recognized as the means by which the gravitational pull becomes accessible to specific conscious beings. The framework that Rumi articulated through the reed flute metaphor provides a specific image within which the practice can be conducted. The wounds that embodied existence inevitably produces are not, on this framework, features that should be eliminated, but features that allow the gravitational pull to be felt in the specific way that conscious experience makes possible. The cultivation of attention to these wounds, conducted with the kind of sustained engagement that the Sufi tradition has developed, is one of the means by which the practitioner participates in the gravitational pull rather than being merely drawn by it. The specific implementation of the Kazibe practice can be conducted within various religious frameworks or independently of any specific religious framework. The practice involves the regular attention to the moments of longing that arise within conscious experience, with the longing being recognized as a signal that the gravitational pull is operating within the conscious life. The practice does not require the elimination of the longing or the substitution of more pleasant experiences for it. The practice involves the cultivation of attention to what the longing is actually toward, with the cultivation revealing the deeper structural reality that the longing is responding to. The framework treats longing not as a deficit that should be eliminated, but as one of the principal means through which conscious existence engages with the deepest forces that operate within and around it. A third practice draws on the Mevlevi tradition of Sema, the whirling movement that embodies the gravitational pull in concrete bodily form. The practice does not require the formal performance of the Mevlevi Sema in its traditional context. The practice involves the cultivation of bodily awareness of the relationship between the local self and the broader gravitational structure that operates throughout the cosmos. The practice can be conducted in various adapted forms, including through movement practices that engage similar bodily principles, with the underlying recognition being that the body itself is one of the means through which the gravitational pull becomes accessible to specific conscious beings. The framework treats the body not as a hindrance to spiritual engagement, but as one of the principal means through which spiritual engagement becomes possible. A fourth practice draws on the Buddhist tradition of meditation on dependent origination and the broader framework of recognizing the interpenetration of all phenomena. The practice involves the regular cultivation of awareness that no phenomenon, including the conscious experience that one is having at any specific moment, exists in isolation from the broader network of relationships that constitutes reality at its deepest level. The image of Indra's net provides a specific framework within which the practice can be conducted. The conscious being is, on this framework, one of the jewels in the net, with the consciousness reflecting all the other jewels and being reflected in all of them. The cultivation of awareness of this interpenetration, conducted with the kind of sustained attention that the Buddhist tradition has developed, is one of the means by which the practitioner moves from the merely localized framework that ordinary consciousness sustains to the broader framework that the deeper recognition makes possible. A fifth practice draws on the Taoist tradition of Wu Wei, the cultivation of effortless action aligned with the natural flow of the Tao. The practice involves the cultivation of sensitivity to the gravitational pull of the natural way as it operates within specific situations, with the cultivation being the means by which the practitioner responds to circumstances in ways that align with the deeper flow rather than against it. The practice does not require the cessation of action or the withdrawal from engagement with the world. The practice requires the cultivation of attention to what the situation is actually calling for, with the calling being a feature of the broader gravitational structure, rather than something that consciousness imposes on the situation from outside. The framework treats consciousness not as separate from the gravitational pull, but as one of the principal means through which the gravitational pull becomes accessible to specific situations. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the conscious being and the gravitational forces that operate throughout reality. The relationship becomes less an unconscious participation in forces that the conscious being does not recognize, and more a conscious engagement that contributes to the broader purpose of the participation. The attention to the gravitational pull becomes less an occasional recognition during specific moments of insight and more a sustained orientation that informs how the practitioner lives. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with one of the principal forces that constitute the conscious life, with the deepening being possible across the entire span of the embodied existence. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward, not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed, a recognition. A recognition that the consciousness you have right now is not merely the byproduct of biochemical activity in your brain, but may be participating in physical processes that connect your conscious experience to the deepest structures of reality. A recognition that gravity, the very force that shapes space-time itself, may be the mechanism through which consciousness operates at the most fundamental level. A recognition that the contemplative traditions, across widely separated cultures and across thousands of years of careful attention, have articulated in their own different vocabularies recognitions about the gravitational pull that draws consciousness toward its proper destination, that contemporary research is now in a position to engage with seriously. A recognition that the cultivation of relationship to these gravitational forces is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, that the cultivation can be practiced through the methods that the traditions have developed across thousands of years, and that the cultivation has effects on the embodied life that you currently have. The question of whether the philosophical and contemplative frameworks that have been examined are correct in their strongest forms is a question that no current investigation can answer with full certainty. The question of how you can inhabit a life in which consciousness is one of the principal modes through which the deepest forces of reality become manifest is a question that you are in a position to answer through the choices you make and the practices you cultivate. The body that reads these words has, across the moments of this reading, generated consciousness through processes that may involve the very gravitational mechanisms that shape spacetime itself. The consciousness that you have right now is not merely yours in any narrowly individual sense. The consciousness is the means by which the deepest forces of physical reality become recognizable within the specific embodied form that constitutes your existence. The gravitational pull that operates throughout the cosmos, that draws galaxies toward each other across vast distances, that holds the planets in their orbits, that shapes the very structure of space-time, is the same force that, on the convergent frameworks we have examined, may be operating within your conscious experience at this very moment. The implications for how you should understand the conscious experience that you are having are substantial. You are not a localized phenomenon that occurs within an isolated container. You are a participation in the broader gravitational structure that constitutes reality at its deepest level. None of this is hypothetical in any merely speculative sense. The Penrose Hameroff framework has been developed by serious physicists and serious neuroscientists, with the framework receiving increasing empirical support. The contemplative traditions have addressed these themes across thousands of years, with the convergence between their recognitions and the contemporary research being one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought. The question is, what you do with this recognition. You have time. The time is finite. The consciousness that you have, with its participation in the deepest forces of physical reality, will continue for as long as the biological substrate that supports it continues to function. The cultivation of awareness of what your consciousness actually is, of how it participates in the gravitational forces that operate throughout reality, of what destination the loves and longings that constitute your conscious life are actually drawing you toward, is the question whose answer you are in a position to develop through the practices you cultivate and the discernment you bring to the moments of your existence. You are not separate from the gravity that shapes space-time. The gravity is operating within you. The consciousness through which you encounter this very recognition is itself a manifestation of the gravitational pull that draws all things toward their proper relationships. What you do with this recognition is the choice that constitutes one of the central forms of your conscious life. The recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward will not be available to you in the moments when it is most needed as a theoretical framework for analysis. The recognition will be available, if it is available at all, as the cultivated background that has informed your engagement with the gravitational pulls of your life across the years that preceded the moments. The cultivation matters. The practices matter. The recognition that consciousness participates in the fundamental forces that operate throughout reality is a recognition that produces its effects through the gradual transformation of how the conscious being engages with the trajectory of their existence. The gravitational pulls will continue to operate. The patterns will continue to draw you towards specific destinations. What you make of this is the question whose answer you are in a position to develop through the practices you cultivate and the discernment you bring to the moments of recognition that punctuate your conscious existence. The body that is reading these words is not a separate object that exists within a universe that operates according to forces external to it. The body is a specific configuration of the same gravitational structure that organizes the cosmos. The consciousness that operates within the body is a specific manifestation of the same gravitational pull that draws galaxies toward each other across vast distances. The recognition is not metaphor in the merely poetic sense. The recognition is structural claim about what consciousness actually involves and how it participates in the deepest forces that constitute physical reality. What follows from this recognition is the choice of how to inhabit a life in which the gravitational pulls that operate within consciousness are recognized for what they actually are. The weight that you carry is your love. What you love is where you are going. The choice is yours alone to make.